Here we are. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for our August WEAll talk. I hope everyone is very excited about what we're going to be talking here today. Thanks to Melanie van de Velde. I hope that I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Melanie. Melanie's here today to talk about discovering the secrets of the most successful sustainability strategies. Melanie is a member of WEAll. And 15 years ago, Melanie switched a successful career in high-tech multinationals and startups to run a fashion enterprise that empowers young women in the Kibera slum in Nairobi. She discovered the powerful solution business can offer to some of our world's global issues, but was confronted with the challenges posed by conflicting commercial and social aims. Drawing on her award-winning research, she wrote Love Your Legacy, 5 Secrets of Leading Businesses That Build a Better World. She is founder of Big Tree Global, an impact management consultancy, and Big Journeys that empowers people from around the globe out of poverty using travel as a force for good. So I'm just gonna allow 3 more people into the room, and just for those who are joining this WEAll talk for the first time, a WEAll talk is a space for conversation. It's a safe space for discussions, for exchanging information and suggestions and ideas and questions. And we are really grateful to Melanie for giving us her time and sharing her knowledge with all of us. While she is sharing everything she is done, you have any questions, please leave them on the chat. I'm going to be taking care of that. And if not, you can always wait until the end of her presentation, because this is a space where you will open your mics and you can talk to each other and throw questions to Melanie at the end of her presentation. So I hope I'm not forgetting anything super, super important. Welcome everyone. And thank you, Melanie, for being here with us today. Melanie, all yours.
Hi, everyone. Delighted to talk to you all this afternoon. Thank you, Anna, for the lovely introduction. I have only recently got involved with WEAll and love the idea of a well-being economy. And it very much aligns with my research and also the book that I've written about, of which, I'd like to share the key insights with you today. And it's really coming from the role of business towards a well-being economy, and particularly our key global issues. And so the insights I'll be sharing with you are very much around how can business most effectively contribute to that and play a role towards a well-being economy, positively or negatively. Okay, sorry, hold on. Yeah, there we go. So let's have a look just briefly at what are our key global issues and how does business really relate to that? Well, these days we hear a lot about global warming, pollution, with extreme weather events having tripled since 1960. We don't hear an awful lot in the news, at least not in the news that we watch, about poverty. Maybe because it's been around for so long and therefore not really regarded as news. But it's still the first UN Sustainable Development Goal, with more than half of our world struggling to meet basic needs. We don't hear as much about rising inequality either, even though prominent experts, like, for example, Professor Stiglitz, he used to be the chief economist at the World Bank, and also won the Nobel Prize, who warn us for the dangers of the rising inequality, dangers such as rising crime rates, mental health and well-being issues, and not just for the people worse off, but for everyone in society. Also the risks for more divided societies and social unrest and the polarization of societies, which we can see quite well in countries that are quite high up on the inequality ranking, like the US. If we only look at the recent elections, for example, the UK, who's got quite high levels of inequality, we can see it very clearly there as well in recent elections and like the Brexit vote. But most countries around the world, apart from just a few exceptions, are following this trend. So how are we going to fix it? How can we effectively fix these issues? and genuinely create a well-being economy. And what is the role for business, really? Well, almost no one believes that business doesn't have a very important role to play. And if we look at the words of Secretary General of the UN, we have to mobilize the private sector. It's 75% of global GDP. So whilst it involves a range of players involving education, policies, governmental policies, we're just not going to solve it if business isn't going to play their bit. And research also shows, there was a study by PwC, that 99% of CEOs believe that they have an important role to play. They recognize that. But the study also shows that the vast majority struggles as to how they can best contribute and what is their role, and lacking the tools and the knowledge for that. So that's what we'll really look at today. And if I just briefly about my own journey with this, for me, the plant, the seeds for my journey with all this really started back in 1984 when the Ethiopian famine was in the news. And to me, coming from, you know, a fairly wealthy country like the Netherlands, that at the time was also fairly equal, this was such a shock to see the poverty that exists in our world. And still to this day, it shocks me. And if we think about it, over 5 million children die each year due to poverty-related causes, such as hunger and malnutrition. And 5 million, that is nearly 3 times more than all the people who died last year from the global pandemic. So something that to me is a huge injustice, you know, together with all the other issues that we're facing. And if I think about my little girl, when I pick her up from school and she runs home talking about, "Mom, would you like to be a flying puppy or a flying other animal?" And to me, that is really what children should worry about. Yeah. But first, I got sidetracked. Like Anna said in the introduction, I ended up studying industrial engineering and MBA, and worked for technical companies like this one in the south of France, which was lovely. But I always kept that strong feeling of wanting to do something about this, but not really knowing how and what. And I traveled a lot to India for my work, where, you know, there was obviously a lot of poverty and still out on the streets. And, you know, a lot of people, I guess, are in that boat. You want to do something, but what do you do? And the initial thing is often, let's maybe donate to charity. But how are we structurally going to solve that? So roll on about 10 years, and I started running a foundation as well as a social enterprise in the Kibera slum in Nairobi. And what we did was, first of all, we helped young children in primary school who were orphaned with school uniforms, school fees, a food program to make sure they could stay in school. And we also supported an external program. It was a vocational schooling program for young women without an education, and to train them with tailoring skills to build a kind of a sustainable income afterwards. But what it made me realize is that, yes, you can provide education and it's a great step forward. But if at the end of it, there is still not an opportunity to make a living, we haven't really solved it either. And so if we looked at the vocational schooling, out of the few hundred girls that graduated each year, only 2 or 3 of them managed to set up their own micro business or find a job and earn a living. So a very low success rate. And it made me also realize that, look, actually business can offer great opportunities if we get it right. So our next step was to set up a social enterprise. We built this brand called Johari that we used, you know, to create great designs and also to have a vehicle, a sales channel for the women to sell the clothes that they made in different countries around the world. And I'd love to say that was a huge success and it all ended well for everyone, but it wasn't. It was really hard to do this right, to make it into a profitable business and to do right for the business to sustain and grow, but also for the young women to genuinely come out of it with a secure future. So when I did my research, I realized I'm not the only one who finds that challenging. The vast majority of people I've spoken to who operate in this area of trying to balance business with creating some positive value for the world is a hard thing to do. And that often profits and people and planet are in conflict. So when I talked to one of my interviewees, he actually called it the Holy Grail. I just don't think it's possible. But if we look at some great examples around the world, like the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, they've lifted over 9 million mothers out of poverty and their families, and it's a profitable bank. Patagonia is another quite well-known example based in California, an outdoor clothing company who tackle environmental issues really quite effectively. So it is possible. So what I was really wanting to know is, why are there just very few examples that do this well whilst the majority struggle, but also what sets them apart? So are there any factors, any kind of best practices, key lessons learned that we can take into account to do this more effectively? So I studied that over the past 7 years, pretty much. I interviewed many sector experts around the world, including Professor Yunus, who set up the Grameen Bank. I looked at different case studies from around the globe, lots of related studies and ancient philosophies, and really analyzing the kind of core patterns in thousands of snippets of data, distilled down to 5 key factors. And what I realized, first of all, is that it's not necessarily the emphasis. There are some great businesses on the end of the kind of social business that focus a lot more on making a difference and profit second, that have great outcomes, but many who don't. And similarly, on the other end, there are businesses that are profit driven first and foremost, but have better outcomes compared to others. So it's more about how. And the first key insight to me was, well, there are examples who tend to deal more with symptoms. And an example of this is Tom's Shoes, an American company. And they use the buy one, give one model, or we often see a buy one, give a percentage model, for example, which essentially is a fundraising model to then make donations. So with Tom's, for every pair you buy, they donate a pair of shoes. And whilst it can help to alleviate an issue, like we did with our food program in the Kibera slum, you're not fixing the root cause. So in the Netherlands, we have a saying, we're mopping up with the tap wide open. So we have to keep doing it. We have to keep throwing money at the solution because we're not fixing it. And research also shows that whilst charity is sometimes the right and vital solution, for example, in the case of emergencies, if we use it as a structural long-term solution, it can do harm. So for example, when clothing donations really ramped up in Africa, over 50% of employees in the textile industry lost their jobs. So it worked counterproductive. But also research shows that doing things for people, as opposed to empowering them to do it themselves, can have negative psychological impact. For example, it can lead to fear, desperation, shame, humiliation, and depression. So if we compare this to a whole different example, Soul Rebels was founded by an Ethiopian businesswoman called Bethlehem Tilahun. And she says, well, if you give a child a pair of shoes and they grow out of it, what do they have? So what she does instead is she has founded Soul Rebels, which is now Africa's fastest growing footwear brand. So a very successful business. And she provides parents with excellent employment opportunities, with fair income and good healthcare. So this empowers parents to buy children their own shoes, or they might need something else, right? A child might be sick with pneumonia needing antibiotics, or might need a school uniform. So it's a more structural, empowering solution. And then there's examples that sit more in between, like Aravind Eye Care in India. They have amazing impact as well. They help to prevent blindness. And if we look at blindness, a quarter of the world's blind live in India, and they provide excellent eye care. And for people who can afford it, they charge $1,000, but people who are poor pay only $16. So they're not tackling the root cause of why people struggle to afford an operation, but it's a good in-between solution that is structural and self-sustainable. But so essentially, the more we tackle the root cause of an issue, the more structural and long-lasting the outcomes. So Rebels tackles the first UN Sustainable Development Goal, and it has knock-on effects then on other sustainable development goals, like reducing hunger, for example. And if we look at another example, Tony's Chocolonely, they make amazing chocolate. It's a Dutch company, but they pay farmers a fair income, and not just a fair price, like as in fair trade, but like genuinely what is reflecting the contribution that they make. Which is helping to improve livelihoods and is also helping to eradicate child slavery that we see a lot on plantations in West Africa. And another example, a case study I looked at during my research, one that's very close to my heart, is Grassroots in India. So they work with little tribal villages where people typically live on less than 60 pence a day. And often are trapped, working on other people's lands for pittance away from their children. And with the extra income through bringing travelers to these areas, they can now work on their own land, use the additional income for better farming tools, but also they have managed to reduce migration to city slums by 80%. So that's the first thing, but it's not the only thing. There are many examples of businesses that try and tackle the root cause or impact initiatives, but that don't have successful outcomes. For example, the venture that we ran in Nairobi. So I had to look deeper than that. And essentially what I found was that this is really the crux of it all. You're probably all very familiar with this symbol, the ancient yin and yang symbol, but maybe less so why this is so virtuous and why it is seen to be hard to achieve. Well, the interesting thing is, what this symbol really means is it is balancing two opposites as part of a whole. I'll explain it better, but essentially, this is not part of human nature. So when humans are faced with opposites, our brains are wired to look at or prefer either one or the other. So in this context, we often either see a business and we accept it's for profit, and they have a secondary sustainability aim. But when we see like a purpose-driven company, we see that as like, yeah, money can be the vehicle. But for example, I know many people who think, right, if you're running a social enterprise, people shouldn't really make good money doing that. It's like these two are not allowed to go hand in hand together. And I love this little anecdote. It's an interesting piece of research of Albert Rothberg back in 1979. He looked at what exceptional geniuses have in common. So he looked at people like Mozart, Da Vinci, Einstein, Picasso, and he looked at what is their common trait, what sets them apart from most others and most of their peers. And he found exactly that, was that they pursued a unity of opposites. So Einstein played with objects both at motion and at rest. Picasso played with visuals of light and dark. And when I looked at those theories, it was like an aha moment, comparing that to the patterns in my data. This is precisely what the impact initiatives, the businesses that try to make a difference with great outcomes have in common compared to the vast majority that struggle. So pursuing both sides as part of a whole leads to synergies. And I'll come back, I'll try and explain a bit better with better examples, but also importantly, what are the two parts, right? And it is clear that the ones that do well, that have these structural solutions, they have an approach that rests more on principles of justice before charity. Let me explain. So what are core principles of justice when we talk about business? Well, number one, to value each party's input fairly. This was already defined by Roman law, that justice is essentially to render each their due. And so I'll come to an example in a minute. So whether we talk about, you know, within an organization, pay gaps, things like that, or within a supply chain, that the prices that we pay, the way we divide the joint wealth created, should be based on people's input. We can take different factors into account, but essentially it needs to be fair. The second is to offer equal opportunities. So really, like Adam Smith already said at the time, like our labor, our talent, our value is our most sacred property. And the third is to warrant no harm. You're probably familiar with the Brundtland Commission, so we shouldn't compromise the needs of future generations. And here are some examples that do this really well. So Hisby Supermarket at the south of England, they apply all these three principles throughout their supermarket, very differently from most supermarkets. So, but particularly in terms of valuing their suppliers, they pay their suppliers 67 pence out of £1, which is very different to mainstream supermarkets. And they do that because it's genuinely reflecting their contribution. So if we look at like what banana and pineapple farmers get, the people who grow and harvest these fruits for us, they essentially get 4% usually. Dairy farmers in the UK get 23 to 25 pence for a litre of milk, which means they tend to not even break even, which has consequences and knock-on effects for how they then treat their staff and also their animals, for example. If we look at offering equal opportunities, I've looked at some amazing case studies that do this really well. So essentially really empowering people to contribute their potential. CTAS and C Talents in the Netherlands is an excellent example that works, for example, with people who have visual and hearing impairments or other disabilities, and looks at their talents specifically, what value does each individual have to offer, and matches them up with companies. And they've also set up a chain of sign language coffee bars as well. And so warrant no harm, so very much the principles of a circular economy. Schiphol Airport, not perfect in every way, but there's one great example. Light bulbs are notorious for being designed for obsolescence, so that their duration is much shorter than they were or used to be, intentionally to sell more light bulbs. And Schiphol went to Philips, their supplier, and said, right, okay, we don't want to buy light bulbs from you anymore. We want to buy light as a service. So we want a contract for 3 years and we just pay you for light. And everything else is now down to you. So Philips designers had a different incentive and started developing durable light bulbs, more energy efficient light bulbs, and fittings that are easier to replace and parts that are easier to replace, as opposed to having to replace a full product each time. But the other side of the coin is that the businesses with excellent outcomes do not forget that profit maximization is also valuable. And that was really interesting. So I'll give you an example of work integration companies that offer equal opportunities, for example, to people who are homeless or were homeless, or refugees, or the young unemployed, for example, long-term unemployed. So essentially it's that justice principle of offering equal opportunity. But the ones that align the opportunities much better with what's in demand in the marketplace have much better outcomes. Not surprisingly, they have a business that is more sustainable. They have a business that is financially stronger and can therefore grow their impact better. But surprisingly, their impact is also much higher. So by equipping people with the skills and the training that's in demand in the marketplace, those people are much more likely to find a job and have better future prospects. But my research also showed a better success rate of getting people employed long-term of 300 to 400% better impact. And additional advantages, like those people showed more confidence, more self-esteem, with all the knock-on effects on better relationships with family and friends and things like that. I won't go too much into what are good profit drivers versus bad ones, but we could, if anyone's interested, also look at that during the questions later. But I mentioned briefly see taste and see talents, and I think Sandra Balai, the founder, has got a great quote. So they do this very strongly. They really look at what is the talent of someone who has a disability, as opposed to let's help this person. So she says, we always focus on the value we can deliver. Hence, that is a great new colleague on your team with a special talent. It's not hire a disabled person, because then you're so responsible. So, for example, people who are blind, for example, they tend to have better listening abilities. It's how the brain rewires. So they match people up that have strong listening skills, but also certain interests in areas, for example, with tapping suspect tapes at the police, or service-oriented roles like mortgage advisors. So there are a few other reasons why this concept and these three key factors are important. First of all, business leaders that want to make a difference, it shares them best practices with them and key factors to take into account. That if they're going to invest $1,000, $1 million in an impact strategy, how can they get the best social return on investment? And just looking at a simple example, let's say they want to do something in the context of homelessness. Well, Pret a Manger donates leftovers to the homeless, and it temporarily alleviates the second UN SDG of zero hunger. If we take it a step up, like we often see homeless street magazines that are more focused on offering an opportunity, and empowering people, which addresses a bit more the root cause of the issue with positive knock-on effects. However, studies show that people tend to buy this not because they want to read the magazine, but that if it wasn't for the impact, they wouldn't buy it. So it's not a good, they're lacking a good product, a good profit driver. They're lacking the alignment with market demand. And if we then look at a whole different example, Brigade is a fantastic bar and bistro in London near the Tower Bridge. And they work with people who were previously homeless or come from other real disadvantaged backgrounds. And they select people who have a real interest in becoming a chef and a potential talent, like any business would employ people. And then they also empower them with proper training, accreditation, experience, and they have an excellent success rate of 72% of people who come out of it who have long-term, but also meaningful employment. And the people I've spoken to who've come through that program, they're beaming with excitement and confidence versus people that I've spoken to who are homeless and sell homeless street magazines. So quite a different thing, whereby we can see the synergies of getting both sides of the coin right. Secondly, recognizing that we're talking about justice really helps prioritizing things easier, right? This is a real tension for business leaders. If my job security, my bonus is on the line, how am I going to justify doing something that's better for the environment, but is reducing my short-term profits, right? And if it's a more of a charitable, let's say, initiative, that's harder to justify, particularly when harder times come along. Charity has the nature of it's desirable, and justice is enforceable. The thing is just that we are not recognizing it as justice enough yet. But so if we look at some examples, let's look at Unilever. It's really pioneering this. We're a sustainable company and typically go for the win-win scenarios. So for example, they have these sustainable living brands that has contributed to 70% of their turnover growth. That's a nice tick for profits and a tick for the environment. Or reducing energy use reduces costs and is good for the environment. So they're easy, right? And that's what we see is what companies tend to do. But studies say, look, this is the tip of the iceberg. We're not going to fix our global issues if we're stopping there. What about all the other trade-off scenarios? Like, for example, sticking with Unilever, when they took over Ben & Jerry's, who really lived those justice principles through and through, they replaced the eco-friendly print containers that were more expensive with cheaper ones, but harmful. We see it with the vast majority of chocolate manufacturers that still don't pay a fair price to their suppliers, leading to child slavery and extreme poverty on the plantations. We see it with all the apparel that's made with traditional cotton, which is produced with highly toxic chemicals. But Patagonia does pay more as a higher cost working with organic cotton. We talked about obsolescence already. We don't see that just with light bulbs, but household appliances, smart cars, even pens. So that is quite an ingrained practice that is not recognized either. And last, the last point, why it is important to recognize, more on the side of that profit maximization isn't all evil. It is the absence of justice principles that's caused the issues, not the drive for profit itself, right? Delivering a better service, a better product has virtue for everyone, as long as we fairly reward everyone involved, we're not causing any harm. And that's important because we see a lot of policies, that are kind of based on this presumption that it's profits that's the issue. So we see, for example, the asset lock where, the community interest company, a social entrepreneur is not allowed to make a personal gain if that business is ever sold, for example. And profits and shareholder return needs to be restricted. But these restrictive policies sadly stifle and restrict the sustainability and growth of that impact company. And it's also not fair. Why, let's say you have a cafe, right, that works with refugees, gives them great opportunities, super organic, environmentally friendly, and they should be restricted in financial rewards. But the cafe next door that doesn't operate with the same principles can. And why would you give one an advantage over the other? So my suggestion would really be is if we want to really fix the contribution of business to our global issues and towards a well-being society, is to develop policies much more around enforcing and incentivizing these justice principles across all businesses and not just around impact businesses. And Adam Smith, who is really seen as the father of our free market economies, he emphasizes at the time, but sadly this bit got ignored. So he said at the time, the free market system that he advocated can only operate with strong principles of justice. And that if we don't, our societies must crumble into atoms. Just final point, one last thing that came across strongly in my research is that sustainability, it's not about jumping from here to there, but it's a trajectory. So Eduardo, a founder of a case study I looked at in Ecuador, said it really beautifully. Sustainability is not a destination, it's a trajectory. And you can never say I made it because you can always improve. And just to summarize the whole thing really as a trajectory, and this is also a bit how businesses and the whole thinking around us is kind of evolving, going from causing harm, and that was all seen as fine in the name of profits with maybe a bit of philanthropy, but really depleting our resources and causing, really contributing to our key issues in the world, to the kind of shared value thinking, stakeholder thinking that tends to really focus around the win-win solutions that we've seen. And to me, really, if we want to really fix the core issues and for businesses to become more regenerating and contribute positive net value to society, is really when we start integrating those two. The good profit drivers, not the bad ones, integrated with the justice principles. I know there's a lot of text on this slide, so don't worry about that. And yeah, I'd say that's pretty much the key concepts, and I'd love to leave you with this quote by Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And to me, having interviewed, so many business leaders, pioneers that have struggled through a lot of challenges and hoops to get where they are, has been hugely inspiring. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from them. Well, thank you so much for listening. If anyone is interested to read more about it, you're very welcome to buy my book. I'd love to get to the questions and answers, but also if anyone has any thoughts or thinks some of it really didn't make sense or would like to know more, then yeah, I would love you to get in touch as well. So I'd like to hand back to Anna to see if there's any questions from anyone.
All right. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you so much for everything that you have shared with us. I'm positive that there is so much to talk about in this. But first, I would like to, Anna, if you want to open your mic, I just want to make sure that you get responded to the question that you put on the chat. That sounds really like an anecdote. You were talking about an anecdote. What did you say the source was? But I'm not remembering exactly. Do you?
Yeah,
it was at the beginning.
Hi, Melanie. It was, you said something about exceptional geniuses and them looking at opposites. I wonder if you could just repeat that, because I was like, oh, that sounds really cool. And then couldn't put it together in my head.
Yeah, so that was really the study by Albert Rodeberg. So he looked at people like Mozart, Einstein, Da Vinci, Edison, Van Gogh, and looked at why did they become so leading in their field? What was different from everyone else, right? That was maybe also a great composer, but why did they get to something so exceptional? And that was exactly what he found. It wasn't so much that they had like exceptional talent or exceptional high IQ, for example, but the one trait that they had in common compared to their peers was that they pursued the unity of opposites. So the examples from the top of my head, I can send you a reference to it as well if you'd like to read more, is, for example, that Einstein played with objects both at motion and at rest. Picasso played with visuals of both light and dark, and like Mozart really played with concordance and discordance at the same time. So that's where he realized that is the thing that is not in our human nature. People tend to either pursue one or the other, or prefer one or the other, but mostly we struggle in our brain to pursue both as part of a whole. That was the comparison.
I got that sentence as well. I brought it down. Pursuit, the unity of opposition. It's a good one. Okay, so anyone would like to, Bob, you don't have to write it down. Now is the time for everyone to speak. If you just, if you can just raise your hand so I can keep order. Bob, please feel free. And Mike, I let you talk as well after Bob, if that is great. All right, all yours.
So Melanie, this is really, really good stuff. I love the way you framed it all. And the word justice is a very consistent theme through a lot of what you're talking about, social justice. But we don't hear that used very much in discussions with corporations. On the other hand, there is quite a lot of chatter about repurposing corporations, so that the purpose of a corporation evolves from maximizing shareholder wealth to maximizing stakeholder well-being. Well-being starts to sound a little bit more like justice, fairness and justice and so on. Do you see the effort to repurpose corporations as a bit of a wake-up call that we need to be paying a little bit more attention to justice in the system?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you totally get to one of the key points really is that I think a lot of corporations are exactly still at that curve of how they're evolving with their corporate social responsibility or sustainability strategies. Really, indeed, the focus is now very much on stakeholder value, like you say, or there's a similar word called shared value, which means, the win-win thinking. But see, the thing is, right, it's cool to say right now our purpose is to think about all our stakeholders. And that's great. And particularly if there is a win-win scenario. However, when it comes to the crux, of, for example, you know, the example I gave of Unilever as well, you know, are we going to keep these machines or not? Well, that's going to cost us a lot, and that doesn't really work great for our short-term profits. And then planet loses out. So what you see is that the weak stakeholders, so the environment tends to be a weak stakeholder. You know, similarly, well, employees, there is also a lot more thinking about, right, if we invest in employees, it actually does pay off as well. So it can be seen as a win-win, but definitely not always. But there are other silent stakeholders, like, for example, the people who are excluded, right? How are we going to, you know, reintegrate refugees or the long-term unemployed or people with disabilities, for example? So that doesn't tend to happen very well unless we recognize, right, this is a matter of justice and we need government policies around this. And we see that more. So we see that, like in the Netherlands, there is the participation law for people with disabilities. We see incentives of, if you take on someone from a difficult background, there's maybe like subsidies around that. But in many contexts, we're really lacking laws around this still. Like the design for obsolescence, for example, is now a criminal offense in France, but it's not in most other countries. I think a very important one is really around the fair pay, right? The recognition that pay, suppliers pay and staff pay, it shouldn't be based on a position of power, but really we should recognize what is the inputs by people, right? If a cocoa supplier is contributing, let's say, 20% of the chocolate bar, why are they not getting 20% of the final price, but 1 or 2%? And to me, this is we're conveniently not recognizing that as a justice principle, whereas essentially we're stealing someone else's share, right, that they're due. And I think it's not always on purpose, like, okay, we're being greedy. I think it's a lack of recognition, really, in how we do business. But sadly, it is really contributing to, yeah, the inequality. I mean, if we look at the pay gap, how that has increased and increased. At the moment in the US, it is the 200 to 400 times, you know, the gap between the top worker to the average worker. In the Netherlands is now number 5 on that list, which shocked me. That's now 171 times a typical worker. In Sweden, it's 1 to 60. In Japan, it's 1 to 16.
Yeah, it's 163 in Canada.
You know, that we're creating unequal, divided societies. So I think there needs to be a lot more recognition. And I think if business leaders recognized it, I think most people don't want to do wrong, right? It's more the recognition, but sometimes also law enforcement that helps with the recognition. Yeah. So I think that's an excellent point. And I think we're very far from that recognition. Yeah.
Right. All good, Bob? Yeah.
Yep.
Wonderful. Mike, it's going to be your turn.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks again for convening us once more. Mike Rowlands in Vancouver, Canada, with a firm called Junction Strategy. Melanie, I really enjoyed your talk, and I particularly appreciate the very humanist, supportive approach. I'm loving that we're talking about social justice in this context. But I'm curious how you reconcile that sort of patient humanism with the very, very urgent need to solve for the climate emergency. You might not have a clear answer, but I'd just be curious to hear you share some reflections about how you balance this humanism with this very real urgency to make change happen.
Thanks. Yeah, that's an excellent question. I have to say my research has been much more focused on, indeed, more the humanist side, so poverty, social exclusion, inequality. But I have also looked at, you know, businesses that are more driven in the context of global warming or pollution, for example. And to me, these principles apply exactly the same way. So to me, the warrant no harm should be recognized as justice, right? I think sometimes social justice to me has a little bit the connotation of sometimes we start to think a bit about charity. But again, I think it is recognized as justice, and therefore it shouldn't be a question. So to me, I think we should see a lot more legislation around emissions, but similarly plastic, the use of plastic. For me, I this is a more personal opinion. My opinion is that a lot of the onus is put on the consumer. And I think, partly, yes, individuals can play a role for sure. But I think it's not always fair, particularly because the more ethical products often tend to be more expensive. And if I look at Glasgow, for example, it's huge inequality. And it's easy for me to shop in a supermarket or, that has more ethical products. But I have loads of friends who come more from deprived areas. Yeah, for them, that's not so relevant. They just need to get by, right? So again, I think if we want to make it fair and for businesses to compete also fairly on these grounds, we need recognition that it's not a noble thing to do, but it should have been something that we integrated from day one. But we need to start doing that, the sooner the better, and make sure that's globally aligned. Otherwise, businesses will just move, right? The ones that want to avoid it. Yeah. Hope that answers your question. Yeah,
it's a big thorny question, right? It's an interesting one, but I definitely appreciate the answer. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Vicky, it's going to be your turn, and then Bob again. Yeah.
Thank you, Melanie. Really interesting. I especially liked your point about the trajectory and understanding that this is a process that we continue to go through. I am particularly concerned, though, how we really account in a business setting, whether it's a social enterprise or civil society, or even social impact investing, for what you're calling justice. And we speak about the triple bottom line, but we don't create a currency that really tracks the benefits. So when you look at an accounting ledger, it's very difficult to understand the actual value of that increased education, for example, increased skill base of those people that actually leave the enterprise, which help them to get there. So how have you given any thought to how one really does the new accounting for justice?
Okay, yeah, I think you're right. I think accounting has a huge role to play. I mean, if we recognize these are justice principles, they should be part of, as we are auditing companies for tax compliance, as much, we should enforce and audit legislation around these three core pillars. So are people fairly paid? Are suppliers fairly paid? Is the staff, is the division of the joint wealth created fairly divided? Are we not causing any harm? Not just environmentally, in terms of pollution, in terms of plastic, in terms of emissions, but also in terms of, are we using ingredients, for example, in food or drinks that can cause harm to consumers? So very much, I like how WEAll talks about pre-distribution. Are we pre-distributing, right? As opposed to, just looking at the redistribution through tax. So I do think audits and accountants there have a very important role to play. I'm not an expert on accountants, but I presume they're totally lacking clear tools and measurements around these all these issues, also simply because on many fronts there isn't really legislation around some of this yet. There is one good tool that you might be interested in. It's called True Pricing. I can send a link afterwards. So this is set up by an impact institute, and this is exactly what they do. They go to businesses and really assess their environmental impact, also negative impact, sort of negative impact, as well as social negative impact. They put a cost around it and say, look, clearly you're not reflecting the true price, right? Your true price is actually this, because we should be taking into account, the external negative externalities. So it's quite a good, I think it's quite a good framework, quite a good start. It covers, a fair bit. So for example, Tony's Chocolonely's, right? We're talking about social justice, I guess, coming back to the earlier question as well. So they do a lot of things really well. They're really contributing to, less poverty, child slavery, but they do have high carbon emissions. So they have had this assessment by this organization. And so they've got a clear report of like, right, okay, you haven't reflected in your price, really taking into account your emissions. So therefore, this is your kind of next steps if you want a better report next year or when we come back. I think there are some good starting points. That particular framework is not really taking into account the just pricing. So whether, you know, the pie is actually fairly divided. So I think it's, again, not the onus on we need to price customers more, because in some cases it's not that they're not paying enough, but it's actually because we're not dividing the pie fairly. But yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
It does. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicky, for your question. And Bob, all yours.
Yeah, I enjoyed that last discussion about value and cost and true cost and how we need better accounting approaches to be able to do the right things around all of that. I want to come back to what Mike Rollins was asking about, because it's driving me nuts. We are running out of runway on a whole lot of issues, environmental and social issues. And the pace at which we've been able to change systems have been way too slow, as we try to help organizations get it on this stuff. It's a great way to change things to help them get it, but we just don't have the luxury of that amount of time anymore. So if you were to try to tease out the top 3 secrets of how to engage businesses in doing more on the environmental and social issues that we desperately need their help on, from the research that you've done, the look at Patagonia and Unilever and the other organizations that you referenced, what are the top 3 secrets we can learn from what it was that caused them to pay attention to this in a more powerful way?
Yeah, okay. Oh, that's a tough one, isn't it? I would say that, look, I have looked a lot at organizations that had a really strong intrinsic drive. So people who, you know, I guess like a lot of people who are here today who really have that drive. So how really already doing that. And I would say that the businesses like the Unilevers are responding much more to what's in the media and I have worked with companies where it's really been the staff asking for it, right? Who say, look, we want to become the Patagonia of travel, for example, or that they see it in their customer surveys, right? We want to travel to places where we leave a positive impact on communities, for example. So, you know, I think business tends to respond a lot more to that. And I like, see, if I look at the news now, since climate change is a hot topic, you see all these businesses jumping on the bandwagon, right? They all want to be doing something about climate change, right? Are they doing it effectively? I think there needs to be a lot more clarity around that. I think that sometimes it's so easy to have a good PR story. And I think therefore, again, I think the most powerful, fastest solution is if we get legislation and companies get audited, or even the threat that's coming. So there is increasing legislation. So also companies have this risk of stranded assets, right? If they're now investing in methods and machinery that are not going to be useful anymore once this legislation comes in place. So I think there's a lot about creating awareness. How do we do that? I think it's great. I think it's harder to get people to come along when you are telling them off. I think it's easier to make them to come along by showcasing great examples and putting these pioneers, the ones that have great success, put them in the limelight. Yeah, I think so. I mean, if I see the growth of the B Corp movement, you know, that seems to be, everyone's jumping on the B Corp bandwagon as well. And I think that's ticking a lot of boxes, but also not everything.
But again, the B Corp movement is appealing to people who are already on that wavelength.
Yeah.
Like I'm a certified B Corp. I'm on this B Corp Standards Advisory Council, and frankly, we are certifying the converted.
Yes.
These folks already were doing this. They just weren't publicly recognized for doing what they're doing. I'm
Yeah.
talking with the 90% that aren't on that wavelength out there, and how we, and you mentioned governments, and I think that that's one force, but in North America, the chance of that happening is considerably less than in Europe.
Yeah.
You also mentioned the pressure from stakeholders like employees and customers. I think that's also important too. But there have got to be better levers for us to pull to be able to engage businesses, maybe kicking and screaming, but engage them in a lot more solutions rather than defense mechanisms as to why they're not doing more.
Yeah.
And I think we're at the point where we need to take the gloves off a little bit on this and really try to figure out how we're going to make this happen, because our soft approaches haven't worked for the last 50 years. And somehow we have to engage businesses better.
Maybe also, you know, I loved, what's her name again? Oh, I'm not very good at remembering names, but you know, the old lady who was part of the Supreme Court in the US, forgot her name. Sorry?
Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yes,
There
exactly.
you go.
Yeah, and I love what she says. It's like, you know, change does happen one step at a time, but it can tackle then suddenly real big issues. If suddenly the use of plastic was going to be illegal across the world, that would have an impact, right? Then businesses would do it.
Right.
I wonder, like, see, I don't come from the justice side, but are there people who could just take cases to court? You know, like how her little cases, right, of women who said, right, me and my business, I'm not treated rightly. A small case gets taken to court and suddenly sets a precedence then for all businesses, right? That could be, I think we need to come at it from every possible angle.
I totally agree. I
Yeah.
totally agree. There's no silver bullet. We need a lot of different approaches. Thank you.
And just because of you are mentioning that, I am aware that we are 1 minute to the hour. And as you know, I try to be very respectful with your time, with the time that I have asked you to spend it with all of us. I think there is an important conversation to continue having around this topic, because it is key. And I think looking at this, that it needs to be approach from different angles, from different areas, from different sectors, from different ways, I think is something that we need to keep in mind. So Melanie, I don't know if you want to leave your email address for anyone who wants to connect with you after this. If you want to continue the conversation, I just want to acknowledge that there has been really important comments on the chat that I'm going to be sharing when I share the recording from Niels, from Lilian. I'm sorry that we're running out of time, but thank you so much for putting it on the chat, because that way it's recorded and we can all read it afterwards. I'm positive that Melanie and everyone who hasn't read it is gonna be grateful for that. And I just want to say thank you, Melanie, for this. Thank you for your time and everything that you have shared, for this conversation that we have all shared with you, for all your comments and everything that you always add value to everything that we do together. And please continue the conversation. You can reach each other through the Slack, through the WEAll Citizens platform. If you need me to connect any of you, just let me know. I'm here for that. And thank you again. And spend a wonderful day, evening, night, wherever you are in the world. Just enjoy it.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.